Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this week's Macro Sutra. In this episode, we will talk about the latest data on consumption expenditure across Indian states. To understand what this data is, what it means for the economy and larger consumption trends seen in the country, we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Radhika, these numbers are coming after 11 years. Can you give us a brief on what, highlights of what these numbers mean?
Okay, so this is the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey that is normally released after a gap of 5 years. But after 2011-12, when the 2017-18 numbers were released, they were junked on account of quality concern. So now we have the new survey after a gap of 11 years. So it's basically telling us about the monthly per capita consumption expenditure of households in rural areas, in urban areas, across states. So it gives us an insight into the consumption expenditure, that is number one. And secondly, it also delves deeper into the composition of consumption expenditure. That is, where are people spending? Are they spending more on food or are they spending more on non-food? Is there a decline in the percentage spent on food across the different survey rounds? And within food, where are they spending? Are they spending more on cereals or are they spending more on vegetables or processed foods or protein rich items? So it gives a glimpse of consumption pattern as well as the consumption expenditure. And another key highlight of this is that it also tells us about the state of consumption inequality in the country, because if there is a large gap between rural and urban consumption, then that is something to be thought about. That is something which will require policy intervention. Similarly, if across states there are large scale disparities in consumption expenditure, that is something to be talked about. So these are some of the important highlights that this survey talks about. And if we talk about this survey, basically it's telling us that the gap between rural and urban consumption expenditure has narrowed in 22-23. There is still a gap, but the gap has narrowed to 71% in 2022-23. In the previous round, which is 2011-12, the gap was 84%. So that is one clear-cut indication that consumption expenditure, the disparity in consumption expenditure between rural and urban areas is narrowing. So that is number one. The other point it tells us is that for rural areas particularly, the share of food has come down. In the previous surveys, and if we go back to 99-2000 survey, the share of food in the overall consumption expenditure used to be 60%. And in 2022-23, it has come down to 46% for rural areas. For urban also it has come down, but the share has come down more drastically for rural areas, and the decline is more prominent in case of cereals. So there is less percentage spent on cereals and more spent on processed foods and milk and milk products. So those are some of the highlights of the survey.
So before we get to other questions, we actually have an audience question related to what you just mentioned about rural seeing lesser expenditure on food and cereals. So an audience member has asked, how would you read this food consumption data? Because the government is giving food grains to 80 crore people. So if we remove food grains, then they already are getting basic grains. So is this why we are seeing more spend on processed foods and lesser on grains?
So a clear-cut way of understanding this is by looking at the monthly per capita consumption expenditure in usual scenario as well as imputed case. So this time around, the NSSO has given an estimate of monthly per capita consumption expenditure after including the imputed values of the free goods and services that the government is providing, which will primarily include the free food grains. But if we see the consumption pattern, and if we see the share of consumption expenditure on the various food items in the usual scenario and after including the imputed values, we don't see much difference. So even in the normal scenario, when the benefit of free food grains is not given, in that scenario also we see that the share of processed foods, beverages has increased and the share of cereal has come down. And the second part is that this comparison we are doing from 2011-12 till 2022-23. So the free food grain scheme was only introduced in the aftermath of COVID. So it wasn't there before. So if we compare the normal case and the imputed case, we find that there is only a very small increase in the consumption expenditure. It's only 82 rupees increase in the rural monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and even lesser, around 60 rupees for urban monthly per capita consumption expenditure, once we include the imputed values of the free goods and services provided as part of the various social welfare scheme. So the consumption pattern remains intact in the normal scenario as well as when we include the imputed values. So we can safely say that the percentage share of consumption expenditure on cereals has indeed come down, because even in the normal case, when we don't include the benefits of imputed values, we see a decline in cereals share and an increase in processed foods.
Radhika, you mentioned that expenditure between the spending between urban and rural, that gap has closed, but there are still inequalities that we have seen in urban as well. So can you take us through those inequalities both for rural, urban? Are these worrying trends?
Right. So there are various ways of looking at this picture on inequality. One obvious measure is to just compare the rural and urban monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and there we see that the gap has narrowed. So still the urban monthly per capita consumption is higher than rural, but it has the gap has narrowed as compared to the previous rounds. So that is number one. The second is, if we just compare the top and bottom 5% of population within urban regions, so not comparing rural urban, but within the urban region we are comparing different population groups based on their monthly per capita consumption expenditure. If we divide them into equal parts, we may call them fractiles or deciles. If we divide that and then we compare the monthly consumption expenditure of top 5% and bottom 5%, the disparity is more in urban areas as compared to rural areas. So rural areas top 5 and bottom 5, and urban areas top 5 and bottom 5, if we see the gap is more in urban areas. So there is a relatively more level of inequality in urban areas, so that even in urban areas the top 5% monthly per capita consumption expenditure is more than 10 times the monthly per capita consumption expenditure of bottom 5%, whereas in rural areas the gap between top and bottom 5% is 7.5 times. So that is the inequality that still persists between rural and urban. It has come down across successive rounds, but if we just compare urban and rural, the relatively there is more inequality amongst the urban regions between the top and bottom population.
So Radhika, is this worrying, and do we have any clarity on why this is there, and which goods and services are
so
causing
I think
this
it's
gap?
more to do with the government schemes. I think government schemes are working in rural areas, so we are seeing that the level of inequality is bridging in rural areas, whereas it is still relatively more prominent in urban areas. We see the impact of free food grains, and we see the impact of other social welfare schemes. So in fact, that is the outcome, that is the inference that we can make. If we compare the rural and urban level inequality, we can say that it's the impact of welfare schemes on rural population that has led to narrowing of the gap between the top and bottom 5%.
If we come to the states, which are the states which have higher spending and which are on the lower end of this list, and the reasons why we have this?
So if we, that's the new feature of this detailed report. We had a fact sheet which was released in February, but now we have a detailed report of the monthly household consumption expenditure. And there we see that there are the states, Chhattisgarh has the lowest monthly per capita consumption expenditure in both rural and urban areas across the major states. So they have the report does an analysis of 18 major states. So if we talk about these 18 major states, we see that Chhattisgarh has the lowest monthly per capita consumption expenditure. And if we look at the state which is on the higher side, we see that Kerala features as a state which has a higher monthly per capita consumption in the rural areas. And if we talk about urban, then Telangana is one of the state which has higher monthly per capita expenditure in the urban areas. So there is this disparity, though as we talked about the fact that rural and urban level consumption disparity is being bridged in successive rounds. But if we look at within states, we do see these level of inequality or disparity or difference in consumption expenditure, both across states and within a state also between rural and urban region. It has to do with the share of industry, which what is the pattern of the economy, the more percentage of population is involved in which segment. So it all has to do with that. So it's quite obvious that Kerala has higher monthly per capita expenditure. We can gauge that this is correct. Telangana has higher monthly per capita expenditure. Its industrial segment is doing well. Its economy is better as compared to structure of the economy in Chhattisgarh. So we can make these inferences, but if we only go by the report findings, we do see these disparities in the consumption pattern.
Radhika, do we also know in states, which are the states where rural and urban expenditure, the gap is narrower and where it's higher?
Yeah, so again for Chhattisgarh, which has the lowest monthly per capita consumption expenditure, there the gap between rural and urban is the highest. So that means that there the rural consumption expenditure is lower, much lower than the urban monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and that in fact explains the reason why the state as a whole has lower monthly per capita consumption expenditure, whereas in states like Kerala, the gap is narrower. Another interesting fact is that if we look at Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, seemingly both states are they look similar in terms of their economic performance. But if we look at the rural urban gap, there is a distinct difference in these two states. Karnataka has a difference of more than 74% in the urban and rural MPCE, the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, whereas Tamil Nadu has the gap between urban and rural consumption expenditure is just 44%. So while we can infer some amount through the structure of the economy, but then there are some states which which look similar, but there also there is wide ranging difference between the urban and rural consumption expenditure.
Radhika, I'll take an audience question here from Aditya. Aditya is asking, what, according to you, are the reasons that middle class debt is rising at a sharper rate? Is it because of changes in personal consumption pattern, or is it more about spending on luxury items or easy availability of money through lending apps?
Yeah, so if we look at consumption and if we look at the structure of bank credit, we've seen that it is the personal loans component which is rising at a fast pace, and we saw last year in November RBI tried to put brakes on this sharp rise in unsecured personal lending as well, and also has given guidance to banks and apps to limit loans through these apps. So there is this concern around sharp increase in lending to retail, to individuals, to households. Now at the same time, what we are seeing is that there is this increase in the level of leveraged consumption, that households are borrowing and they are using this money for either investing in real estate or they may be investing in gold, and that is if we look at the parallel data set of savings, we see that there is a shift from financial savings to physical savings. So there is this increase in debt, and this debt is being used towards physical assets. Is this a symptom of distress? That we cannot say with certainty, because we don't have income level details of which households are borrowing. But what we can certainly say is that there is one section of population, those that are involved in the global capability centers, they are having higher level of income, and at the same time their aspirations are higher, so they are borrowing more and they are buying luxury houses. So there is this trend towards premiumization, which is also fueling the demand for credit, and therefore leading to increase in debt. But beyond a point, it will become concerning, and therefore the RBI has already started to take steps to limit the spiraling rise in household borrowings.
Okay, we do have a lot more audience questions today. So Mridul wants to know, we know that a lot of goods are subsidized in India for the poor, and often the survey tends to underreport consumption because of that. This time they have calculated imputed value of goods, which you also pointed out, but as per CEA that is still isn't enough. What is your opinion on this, and to what extent does the survey considering the subsidized goods and services accurately?
So of course, if we talk about the report also points out that this is underestimation, because they have not been able to capture the entire spectrum of free goods and services that are provided by government. So it's not possible. Some they have provided list of items that are included in the estimate while arriving at the estimate of monthly per capita consumption expenditure, which includes this free food grains, the laptops that are given, the other services. But at the same time, sometimes this free health and free education that is provided, cashless services, the survey is not able to come up with an estimate, and therefore the imputation of these services are not part of the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, and therefore to that extent it is an underestimation. Maybe when all those things are also included, the difference between the normal MPCE and the imputed MPCE would be much higher. We see that it's only 82 rupees for rural population and only around 62 rupees for urban, because the entire spectrum of free goods and services, including free health, education, is not being captured, and that is the reason why it is an underestimation of the consumption expenditure.
Okay, another question is that somebody has pointed out, Professor Surjit Bhalla has always argued that this survey underreports consumption compared to NAS. Could you explain this controversy a little more?
Yeah, so we have from the National Account Statistics, NAS is National Account Statistics, from there also we get consumption estimates, and we get consumption estimates from this survey, which is the Household Consumer Expenditure Survey. Now this is a survey, and it underestimates to the extent that it doesn't capture the high income group. The high income group and the middle income group consumption patterns are not being captured in this survey, and that's the very nature of the survey design, and that's a typical issue with most of the surveys, that it does not include the higher end of the population in terms of their consumption expenditure. And therefore, even if you look at the consumption expenditure, for Telangana, which features as one of the highest monthly per capita expenditure, it's only 8,000 rupees. So which is clearly an underestimation. If we look at the top population at the top end of the pyramid, consumption expenditure would be way more higher. So to that extent, it tends to underestimate consumption expenditure, and that seems to be a correct explanation, and that is the difference between the NAS estimates and the household consumption expenditure. But NAS also includes certain other things which are not included in households. So this is just the household consumption expenditure, whereas NAS includes some other entities also, like NPSIH. So there are differences, but if we just go by the pure comparability, yes, we can say that HCES, the household consumption expenditure, tends to underestimate overall consumption.
Thank you. We have one last question for today. What is the current poverty incidence based on Household Consumer Expenditure Survey that we are discussing on Tendulkar line and Rangarajan line?
Yeah, so it's something which requires some detailed explanation because when we talk about poverty line, there are two inputs that are needed. One is the level of consumption expenditure below which we will say that any person or population having below this level of consumption expenditure is considered as below the poverty line. And various estimates were given by earlier by Tendulkar and then Rangarajan, and then Tendulkar's estimates were more closer to the World Bank's estimate. So World Bank came up with something called extreme poverty estimate. So Tendulkar's estimates were also in line, broadly in line with the World Bank's extreme poverty estimate. So if we look at those and if we start with those numbers and if we add inflation factors and then we take the numbers that are inflation factors and all is provided in the Household Consumer Expenditure Survey, then we see that the poverty line is for the consumption expenditure below which we say that people are below poverty line comes to somewhere around rupees 1452 rupees for rural population based on the household consumption expenditure based on the inflation factors that are provided as per 2022-23. So any population or household having, and this is for rural areas, so in rural areas if population is having consumption expenditure below rupees 1452, this is coming from Tendulkar's and including the inflation factors, we say that this is below poverty line. Now the other input is that in the HCES, in the report, we have fractile wise consumption expenditure, that is bottom 5%, then 10 to 20%, 20 to 30, and then top 5%, we have that. And there we see that for urban, even for the bottom 5%, the consumption expenditure that is coming from this report is more than the poverty line. It's only for the rural bottom 5% that its monthly per capita consumption expenditure is lower than rupees 1452. So with this we can certainly say that the poverty line is below 5% because 1452 is the arrived at estimate, rupees 1452 is the monthly per capita consumption expenditure for rural areas below which we can say that the population is below poverty line. And if we see the bottom 5% fractile class, their MPCE is indeed below 1452. But for urban, it is more than the poverty line estimate that is coming from the Tendulkar's estimate. So therefore, what we can safely say is that the poverty line based on the Tendulkar's estimate and then adding the inflation factors and then the information that is provided through the household consumption expenditure, we can say that the poverty line has fallen below 5%. Now, how much below 5%? There are various estimates, and Professor Bhalla has done this extrapolation, and he finds that for rural the poverty line is just 2%, and for urban it is fallen below 1%. So overall poverty line is somewhere around 2.5%. That is what is his estimate. But clearly based on the poverty line, the household consumption expenditure and the consumption expenditures that we are seeing, estimate of poverty line, we can say that poverty line has fallen below 5% in 22-23.
Okay. Thank you so much, Radhika. That is all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us.